So as we get ready to fall back with our clocks this weekend, I thought this would be a good chance to talk about why it's time to save ourselves from daylight saving time. As a neuroscientist who studies circadian rhythms, it's always nice to have an opportunity to apply the knowledge that we're getting from the lab and the biology of our circadian system and how it works to try to help make society better. And this has been a big question in the past few years, as many governments are starting to think of doing away with the annual or biannual time change, where we spring forward in the spring and fall back with our clocks in the fall. And many of them are opting or considering moving to permanent daylight saving time. But is that really the best choice? So that's what we're going to look at today. So the key here is to try to understand first how our circadian rhythms work. So our circadian rhythms are generated by a clock we have in our brain, and this is what controls all the patterns of our behavior and our physiology that occur on a daily basis. So the human clock, on average, runs a little slow. So what we're showing here is this is an activity chart from just under a month, showing an individual who's housed in a time-free environment where they would turn the lights on and off themselves, as opposed to have sun rising naturally and sun setting. And what you're seeing in black, for this is day 2 on here, this is when the person was awake and active, and then the little white bar here at the end is when they went to sleep. The little arrow shows their body temperature maximum, so the body temperature shows a circadian rhythm, just like their sleep-wake cycles. And then on the next days below here, you see what time they wake up, and it's a little bit later than they did the previous day. And what we see is for this individual here, you could actually calculate the free running period based on, I think they're fitting a line to their body temperature maximums, and showing that actually in a time-free environment, they woke up 1.6 hours later every day. So their circadian rhythm, their internal rhythm, wasn't 24 hours long, it was 25.6 hours long. So it got up a little bit later. And this is typical. So the human clock runs a little slow. Now, we usually don't have a problem with this because we're synchronized to our day-night cycle. Light is the main cue that sets our circadian clock. And it's exposure to light that is going to nudge you forward and backwards a little bit. And we'll come back to that. But it's also important to think about what the average individual does and how we organize our activity, because we're not always just awake when the sun's up and asleep when the sun's down. So if you think of around the equinox, so this would be third week of March or third week of September, when the day length is equal to the night length. So you have 12 hours a day, 12 hours of nighttime. Most people will wake up around sunset, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later, depending on the individual. But most people stay up way past sunset. So you see a lot of sunsets in your life, but you don't see too many sunrises. And so just to sort of show you that, here's a little graph showing the 24-hour day broken up into starting at midnight here, sunrise. If you're perfectly positioned in your time zone and your time zone is perfectly positioned, then on the equinox, the sun would rise at 6 a.m. You'd have the sun at its zenith at noon, and then it would sunset at 6 p.m. And the average individual gets up around about 6 a.m., right around sunrise, but would probably go to bed at 10, 11 p.m. So you go to sleep many hours after sunset. And that's how we would organize our activity. So the thing to keep in mind here in terms of organizing our activity is that we, as humans, are sort of beholden to 3 clocks. So the first clock that we'll talk about is the solar clock. And this is actually what creates the day and the night. So as the Earth spins about its axis, then different parts of the Earth are facing the sun. And that's what causes our 24-hour day. We have a body clock, our circadian rhythms, and the circadian clock is found in our brain, in an area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it follows the sun. So it's synchronized to the daylight. Then we also have the social clock. So the social clock is what you have on your wall or on your cell phones or on your wrist if you're still like me and wear a watch. and it's the one that we're going to adjust this coming Sunday. Today, as I'm taping this, is October 29th. All right, so now these are often in conflict. So our body clock has to follow the solar day. Thousands or millions of years of evolution have created a clock that follows daylight. And so that's what it's going to synchronize to. But our bosses and our professors, our teachers, all want us to follow the social clock, this agreed upon time that tells us what time we need to get to work or get to school. Now, when this gets to be a problem is when your solar clock and your social clock are out of time. And this is what we call, or out of phase with one another. And this is what we call social jet lag. So you get social jet lag when your body clock is trying to follow the sun, but your body itself has to follow the social clock. And if there's a big mismatch between the two of them, then we call this social jet lag. So this all comes about, this problem, this mismatch, comes about because of time zones. So I'll give you a little bit of a history about time zones. So prior to 1847, time was always determined locally. So basically, we would set our clocks to solar noon, and we'd organize our activity around sunrise and sunset. But basically, the middle of our solar day was at high noon, when the sun was at its highest point, at its zenith overhead. And that's sort of the middle of the light period. And this sort of matches what humans like to do. We usually get up around sunrise, but we'll stay up way past sunset. So even though the high noon is the middle of the solar day, it's not the middle of our waking period. We stay up past that. Now, this got to be a bit of a problem once we were able to travel around. And so they brought in time zones in part and coordinated time because of the railways. And so if you wanted to have your trains running on time and you knew when it was going to arrive, you actually had to get all your train stations running on the same clock. They had to synchronize their clocks. So before doing this in the US, it was about 1884, I think, when they brought it in. You had 300 different local times for the trains in the US. In the UK, it wasn't quite so bad, but still, this is where they brought it in, again, because many of the train stations had slightly different times because of where they were located. So when they brought in this time, they sort of, for the UK, all time was relative to when solar noon occurred in Greenwich, which is just a little bit east of London. And towns that were east of this had earlier noons, and towns that were west of this had later noons. And some places, like got this picture here of the clock on the Corn Exchange in Bristol, which was a little bit west. And they actually have on this clock here 2 minute hands, reflecting the 10-minute difference between Greenwich and Bristol, because people in Bristol really resisted going on to the coordinated Greenwich time, and they wanted to stay with their local time, which ran 10 minutes behind Bristol time. So they had this clock, using clock that actually had 2 minute hands. So this would be showing time in Bristol, and this would be showing time in the train time based on Greenwich time. Now, in 1884, then we had the International Meridian Conference that actually split the world up into 24-ish time zones. It's actually not quite that, because there's 2 half time zones right around the international date line. But when you're dividing the world up into these 24 time zones, actually only one longitude within each time zone is going to have a true solar noon. So a true solar noon is when the sun is at its zenith at 12 noon. Places east of that will have earlier noons. Places west of that will have later noons. So it's a bit of a problem in trying to coordinate time and break it up into these 24 chunks, that you're never going to have an ideal situation where you've got your sun at its zenith over noon, at noon, for everybody within a time zone. It's only going to be one longitude within the time zone. And then this leads to a bit of a weird situation. So this is just a map of the different time zones in the world. And white would be when solar noon is actually happening at 12 noon. And red colors is when solar noon happens too late, and the cooler blue colors are when solar noon actually occurs too early. And so here in Alberta, where I'm located, is you see we're mostly red. So we're actually a little bit later of where we should be. Some places like China have really extreme problems because they're on a single Beijing time. So people in Western China really have very, very late noons. The sunrise is way too late there relative to their own circadian biology. So the social jet lag for people in Western China can be incredibly bad. But it's not just there. There's lots of other places that have the same problem. As you can see, there's lots of red on this map. All right. So what about where I'm located here in Calgary? So this is our longitude here and our latitude. And so the time zone that we have here in Alberta is Universal Coordinated Time -7. It used to be called Greenwich Mean Time, but now it's Universal Coordinated Time -7. So the Mountain Time Zone. Now, the problem with time zones is they don't really line up exactly where they should be. They line up based on provincial or national or state boundaries. So usually governments will set their time zone for that whole province or state or country. Sometimes there'll be two time zones or more. Canada's got quite a few, but they don't actually line up exactly where they should be. So a time zone is 15 degrees wide, and they all are relative to the Greenwich Mean Time would be the ideal location. So if you actually figure out 7 time zones from Greenwich, then the center of Universal Coordinated Time -7 would actually fall at longitude 105 degrees west. But that's and that would actually correspond to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, sort of right around here. So we're actually a bit west of where we should be ideally. And you can actually see this in when solar noon happens here in Calgary. So solar noon actually occurs a little bit later than it should because we're a little bit west of the ideal location for the Universal Coordinated Time -7. The earliest you see noon during standard time in Calgary is 19 minutes after 12. But it can occur as late as 10 to 1 in the afternoon when we're on Mountain Standard Time. And then for when we're on daylight time, it's actually an hour later than this. So it'd be 20 minutes after 1 or 10 to 2 would be the range. Now, just to give you an idea, so here today, October 29th, sunrise is actually at 8:24 in the morning. Noon today is at 1:19, and our sunset's actually going to be a quarter after 6 this evening because we're still on daylight time here. So just trying to give you an idea of how mismatched we are. So this would be the ideal location for Universal Coordinated Time -7, based on being 105 degrees west of the prime meridian. So that would be the ideal center of Universal Coordinated Time -7, which would actually give you boundaries that are for the eastern edge should be very close to Winnipeg, and the western edge of it would actually be very close to Brooks, Alberta. So this would be the ideal location for Universal Coordinated Time -7. Alberta, a little bit of it falls within that ideal location, but most of Alberta, and actually most of Alberta's population, falls quite a bit west of that. So how did we get to this idea of springing forward and falling back? So it turns out Canada, and specifically Port Arthur, Ontario, was the very first place in the world to actually use summertime, use this daylight saving time. And so in 1908, they actually, for July and August, changed the clocks to have later sunrises and later sunsets. So Port Arthur is now what we call Thunder Bay. Alberta itself started using it just after the First World War in 1918. We followed this for 6 years, then went back to just permanent standard time year-round. We went to permanent daylight saving time for the last 3 years of the Second World War, with the idea that this might actually save some energy. And then after that, switched back to permanent standard time. In 1972, then Alberta, like much of Canada, adopted this standard of springing forward in the spring and then having our clocks fall back again in the fall. The idea for this was to save energy by trying to align your wake time with the amount of time that you have for daylight. And so as I mentioned earlier, the average person might wake up within an hour of sunrise, but most go to bed many hours after sunset. So now, while the idea was to save energy, it actually is probably more related to golf and a little bit related to candy. So the person who proposed this idea to save energy by daylight savings time was an avid golfer, and it's been suggested that he was making the suggestion so that we could have more light later in the day, so that he could play golf longer, because he thought that with doing this, then there'd be more daylight, so he would be able to be on the golf course longer. The candy part actually comes from back in 2007, when the US decided to extend daylight savings time by starting it 3 weeks earlier in the spring and ending it 1 week later in the fall. So it used to be that our clocks would fall back on the last Sunday of October, and now we have our clocks fall back on the first Sunday of November. What happened, why we made those changes. So again, it was in part to save energy was the idea, although the evidence is we probably didn't save any energy by doing this. But the candy corporations in the U.S., when they found out that George W. Bush, the president at the time, was considering changing when the country observed daylight saving time, lobbied hard to actually have the start date of standard time, or the end date of daylight time, fall after Halloween. And what this would do would be that sunset would actually occur an hour later on Halloween now, so that there'd be more hours of daylight, so little kids could go out trick-or-treating for an hour longer and get more candy. And to get more candy, the candies corporations would actually be selling more candy to people handing it out. So there was a strong push from the candy corporations to have that pushed back until after Halloween, so that they could have more daylight during Halloween, so there could be longer trick-or-treating. So, but this change, what it does is really shifts our clocks to maximize the amount of light that occurs while we're awake. So earlier, so this is looking at during standard time, we would, again, wake up around sunrise, but stay up way past sunset. And by changing our clocks, this actually then shifts us. So we actually wake up quite a bit before sunset. But now our daylight is occurring, and we're getting more daylight in the evening part when we're still awake. So the idea, you might not have to turn your lights on, was the argument for the saving energy. Though a lot of our light bulbs nowadays are very energy efficient, and they're not actually using that much energy. There's many other things that are on 24 hours a day that are going to be using a lot more energy. So think of even charging your cell phones or your computers that are running. They're going to be consuming a lot more energy than your energy efficient light bulbs. All right, so this is a graph of the sun here in Calgary, and the photo period of sunrise, sunset. And so what you notice is sunrise and sunset changes dramatically over the year. So we're here at the end of October. Our day is shorter than our night. And then when we get into, this is the winter solstice on this little white line here, and it shows you we really aren't going to have a lot of daylight. We get less than 8 hours of daylight here in Calgary on the winter solstice. And but in the summer, we actually don't even get true night. The sun doesn't get far enough below the horizon to give us true night. So the sky is still quite bright, even in the middle of the nighttime here. We end up in what's called astronomical twilight, so it gets darkish, but it's still fairly bright. We sort of lose that true night in late May, early June, and it doesn't come back until about mid-July. All right, so should we change this annual switch, the spring forward, fall back? And I think scientists who've been studying circadian rhythms like me have been really good about getting the message out that these time changes are not good. So of course we should get rid of it. So there's a lot of evidence that this annual spring forward tradition that we have actually isn't good for our health. So it was a Canadian, Stan Corrin from UBC, who actually was one of the first to publish a paper on this, showing that in April, when we lose that hour of sleep, when we spring forward, there's actually an increased rate of car accidents relative to the week before and the week after, when you have similar weather patterns and similar lengths of day. But losing that hour of sleep actually makes people a little tired behind the wheel and can lead to increased rates of car accidents. And then there's a drop in the fall. So when you gain that extra hour of sleep, like we will this weekend, then you will actually have less car accidents on average because people generally get an extra hour of sleep. There's also an increased rate of heart attacks that are noticed in April when we spring forward. There's increased rates of workplace injuries, and they're more severe, again, that week in April after we lose that hour of sleep. Increased rates of stroke. My favorite one, though, is the study that found that there were harsher sentences levied by judges on what's called Sleepy Monday. So that Monday after we lose that hour of sleep, they actually give harsher sentences than they did the previous week or the subsequent week. Now, a number of states have already voted to eliminate it. British Columbia and the European Union are working on this. I think BC passed legislation, but as soon as all the states on the western seaboard of the US also get rid of the biannual spring forward, fall back tradition, that they will follow suit right away. So California has been considering it. Alberta has been talking about it. Ontario has been talking about it again recently. So most states are actually now considering getting rid of this biannual spring forward and fall back. All right, so awesome. You'd think I'd be happy. So why am I not happy about this? So what's the problem? So the problem is, I'm just going to highlight this this is the web page from when BC a year ago in 2019 actually polled the population of BC to see what they wanted, if this was a good idea to get rid of daylight saving time. And the premier, after doing the survey, came out and announced 93% of British Columbians that participated in the public consultation were in favor of getting rid of the seasonal time change and sticking to daylight saving time. So that sounds pretty conclusive. As far as the popularity contest goes, I think the population have voted, and that's what the politicians have been arguing. The problem is with this poll, these were the two choices they were presented with: that BC continues the practice of changing our clocks biannually, or BC adopts year-round observance of daylight saving time. They were not given the choice of year-round natural time, year-round standard time. And the evidence, unfortunately, as I'm going to show you, is that year-round standard time would actually be the better choice for health. And then Alberta, not long after that, actually put out their consultation to the province as well, and modeled it on the BC poll, and again only gave those same two choices of the biannual clock change or the year-round observance of daylight saving time. Again, no choice for standard time. And this is pretty much what all the governments are doing, is they're all considering permanent daylight time. It doesn't matter. So I'll just give you some examples here from Alberta. So this is what we currently have here in Alberta. So in the summer, our sunrise is at 5:21 in the morning on the summer solstice. Our sunset's quite late. It's almost 10 p.m. It's 9:54 p.m. is when we have our sunset here in Calgary. In the winter, when we're on standard time, then on the winter solstice, our sunrise is quite late. It's 8:37 in the morning. That's because we live so far north. And our sunset is quite early. It's at 4:31 in the afternoon, again, because of where we live. If we observe permanent standard time year round, then sunrise would be very early in the morning, 4:21 on the summer solstice. And our sunset would still be quite late, again, because we live so far north and our days are so long here. It would be 8:54 in the evening would be our sunsets. If we move to permanent daylight time, then our sunset here in Calgary would be at 5:31 in the evening. Still pretty early, but again, because we live so far north. Now, the thing that really, though, highlights a bit of the problem with going to permanent daylight time is that our sunrise and the winter solstice in December would be at 9:37 in the morning. So this is very, very late. Other places in Alberta, of course, because they're geographically different, would actually have different sunrises and sunset times. So Medicine Hat, sort of the most eastern major municipality in the province, that right now their sunrise in standard time on the winter solstice would be 18 minutes after 8 in the morning. Edmonton, which is about the same longitude as Calgary, but 2 degrees latitude north, their sunrise is a bit later, so it'd be 8:48 in the morning. And Grand Prairie, which is a municipality that's in the north and to the west, their sunrise on standard time on the solstice is 19 minutes after 9, so quite late. If we went to permanent daylight time, the sunrise in Medicine Hat would be at 9:18. In Edmonton, it would be almost 10 a.m. at 9:48. And in Grand Prairie, it would be almost 20 minutes after 10, quite late. So if we went to permanent daylight saving time, these would be the sunrise times that we'd experience in December in these different municipalities. So could these late sunrises and sunsets be very bad for us? So here's another little activity chart. This is just showing an activity chart of Michel Chiffre, who locked himself in a cave in the Swiss Alps for 62 days, and he recorded his body temperature and his circadian sleep-wake cycles. And you see he got up a little bit later every day, just like the chart I showed you earlier. So our clock does run a little slow, depending on the individual, losing 10 to 30 minutes a day. And our biology, remember, follows the sun. It doesn't follow our social clocks or our wristwatches. It follows the sun. And it's the morning light from the sun that actually moves our clock earlier. And if you're waking up a little bit later each day, like this individual is, you need that morning light to nudge you earlier, keep you synchronized to the 24-hour cycle. It's light in the evening that actually makes you shift later. So seeing light around sunset actually pushes your clock later, makes you wake up later. So people who have a slow clock, and most people do, need that morning light to correct that difference between their free running circadian rhythm and the 24-hour world that they live in. Now, if we move to permanent daylight saving time, this means we're going to have less light in the morning when your body needs that to set your circadian clock. And you're going to get more light in the evening, which actually moves you later. So not only are you not getting the light that's going to correct the imbalance, you're actually getting light at a time that's going to make the imbalance worse. So it's going to push your body clock further west when it actually is supposed to be nudging a little bit east every day. So does this make a difference? So I'm going to give you an example here of Spain. So Spain is on Central European time. It's the same time as most of continental Europe, even though it's due south of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is on Universal Coordinated Time 0, this is the Greenwich Mean Time, and Spain actually is on Central European Time, which is an hour earlier. So due south of the UK, but on Central European Time. So it has really, really late sunrises and really, really late sunsets. They actually did a study in 2013 to look at Spaniards and their sleep habits, and they found that Spaniards actually sleep 53 minutes less than your average European. And because of this lower amount of sleep that they're getting, they concluded that this leads to higher levels of absenteeism at work. So these people miss work or show up late to work more often. They actually have higher rates of stress, more on-the-job accidents, and the kids don't do quite as well at school. So why are they on Central European time, when if you look at it, they really should be on the same time as the UK. And look at Portugal. Portugal is on the same time as the UK, although they're right on the edge of where they should be. They might actually should be on universal coordinated time -1. But in Spain, it's quite late there. So they weren't always. They actually were on the same time as the UK for quite a while. But in 1940, as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis occupied France, they actually met with Francisco Franco, the dictator in Spain at the time, and came up to an agreement of non-aggression. So Francisco Franco had just fought the war to take control of Spain. He didn't want to get involved in another battle, so they met to actually make this agreement to stay, to move, or to be non-aggression towards the Nazis, and the Nazis would invade Spain. And one of the things that Adolf Hitler requested to simplify trade was that they move their time zone to the same as the rest of Europe, the rest of Central Europe. And so they were all on the same time. But previous to that, Spain was actually on the same time as the UK. So it was because of this non-aggression treaty that they came up with that one of the concessions was to move to the same time zone as Germany. All right, so is there any evidence? So that's a nice anecdote of people in Spain having problems based on when their sunrise sunsets are. But what about good scientific evidence that this might be making a case? So they've actually been a couple of studies that looked at how people organize their time and how this might affect their health, looking at the time zones in the US. So what I'm showing here on this graph is these are all the different counties in the US and the time zones that they follow for all the different states. And so the green is Eastern time, yellow is Central time, the reddish pink here is Mountain time, and purple is Pacific time. And what they were doing is comparing people who live near the edges of time zones, so near the eastern and western edge of the same time zone, or the eastern and western edge of adjacent time zones. So I'll give you a couple examples here. So what I'm showing here, this is Panama City in Florida. It's in the Central time zone. And compare that to Pico, Texas, which is also in the Central time zone. So they're quite far apart, almost 1,200 miles apart. Quite a distance here. Very different environments of where they live. Same time zone though. So they still have to get up and go to work and be at their desk at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. whenever it is they got to go to work. Now the sunrise today in Panama City was at 6:54 a.m. The sunrise in Pico, Texas today was at 8:07 a.m. More than an hour later, even though they're all on the same time, they still follow the same clock in these two cities. But sunrise and sunset is much later in Pico, Texas, than it is in Panama City. Give you another example here. This is Amarillo, Texas. It's got about the same sunrise time as Pico, Texas, a little further north, but not too much. And compare that to Albuquerque, New Mexico. So this is less than 300 miles apart. The environment, climate is very, very similar in these two places because they're so close together. But sunrise today in Amarillo was at 8:06. Albuquerque, it occurred a little bit later, but it's in the next time zone over. So in fact, for the people living there in Albuquerque, they experienced an earlier sunrise. So it's at 7:25 a.m. this morning. So it still rose in Amarillo first, and then about 20 minutes later, it rose in Albuquerque, but they're following a different time zone. So for them, it was much earlier. And so this is just showing how sunrise is really the time zone boundaries, and that as you move west, your sunrise and sunset times are going to get a little bit later, and then you hit the border of a time zone, transitions, and now you've got an earlier sunrise, sunset, and then it gets later and later and later again as you move west across that next time zone. And so then, using this approach, then you can actually compare people and their health when they're living based on where they're living and when they're experiencing sunrises and sunsets. And this does seem to make a difference. So this is just a graph. On top here is showing sunset times. And as you move west within a time zone, sunset times get later and later and later. So the darker blue is the later the sunset. It can also be the later the sunrise. And then as you transition to the next time zone, now you've got an earlier sunset time. And then what they're doing is now looking at the sleep habits of people within all these different regions. And what we're seeing here is later bedtimes with darker blue. So as you move west across the time zone, you see the colors on the map here are getting darker. So focusing here on the central time zone, it's quite light blue. On the eastern edge, they're going to bed earlier. And as you go west, you're getting later and later bedtimes. And then as soon as you transition to the mountain time zone, now you're seeing a lot lighter colors. People are going to bed earlier. And then as you move to the western edge of it, it's getting darker again. So bedtimes actually get later, but unfortunately, they still all follow the same social clock within a time zone. So they're going to bed later, but they all still need to be getting up and going to work at the same time. And because of that, they're getting less sleep. So as you move west within a time zone, the amount of sleep people are getting actually decreases. You're getting less sleep. As soon as you transition to the next time zone over, then the amount of sleep will go up. And then as you move west within that time zone, it goes down as well. So the further west you live in a time zone, the later your sunset, the later your sunrise, because you're west in the time zone, the less sleep you're going to get. So this, and actually it's about 19 minutes less each night. So if you actually add that up, that works out to 115 hours less sleep a year that people on the western edge of the time zone are getting relative to people on the eastern edge of the time zone. They're also more likely to get less than 6 hours of sleep. So your average person should be getting ideally about 7 hours of sleep. Some people need a little bit less, some people need a little bit more, but most people fall between needing 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night. And if you're getting less than 6 hours of sleep, this usually is associated with health, adverse health consequences. And they're much, much less likely to get 8 hours of sleep, which would be sort of the optimal amount of sleep recommended. And this does actually seem to have an effect on their health. So this is an overall health index looking at, it's amalgamated a bunch of different diseases in it. But again, as you move west, this health index shows poorer health as you move west within a time zone. And then as you transition to the next time zone over, all of a sudden the health index jumps way up. And then it starts to fall again as you move west within that time zone. With later sunsets, you get actually 11% more people being overweight, 21% more likely to be obese, 19% increase in heart attacks, and increased rate of diabetes as you move west within a time zone. So experiencing later sunsets, later sunrises, and you're getting less sleep and is associated with higher rates of disease. There was another study that used a similar approach looking at rates of cancer. And in this case here, so they looked at 4 million patient records across the US. And with every 20-minute delay in sunrise, there was a significant increase in cancer rates. So these are the numbers here, 9% increase in stomach cancer, 11% more liver cancer, 4% more prostate cancer, so on and so forth. And this is for every 20-minute delay. So when you're thinking of whether we should choose standard time versus permanent daylight time, that's actually a 60-minute delay in sunrise and sunset. So you would actually have to multiply each of these numbers here by 3 to get the true increased rates that you'd see if people were permanently living on permanent daylight time relative to permanent standard time. The other thing is with schools. So teenagers, high school students, and specifically undergrads, their clocks tend to run really slow. And they have very delayed clocks, and their chronotype is more of the evening night owl type. And so they really do struggle to wake up around sunrise, and they struggle in school when school times start before or around sunrise. So when school start time is delayed, they do find an improvement in grades. So if you delay the start of school by an hour, they found that students actually get 34 more minutes of sleep a night. So they do use that extra time to get more sleep. And this all, and as I mentioned, is associated with better performance in schools. The key here is that biology follows the sun. So your circadian clock follows the sun. And so the more time there is between sunrise and the start of school, the better students do. And a number of places have actually started bringing legislation to help students. So in 2019, California was the first state in the US to actually legislate later school start times. So schools were not allowed to start now before 8:30 in the morning. And for some schools, this meant that it was a 30-minute delay in their start time. Some schools are starting as early as 8 a.m. Now, the problem is if we go to permanent daylight savings time, that actually moves sunrise closer to or even later than the start times for schools. And effectively erases the benefit that they've passed with this legislation with the later school start times, but by moving sunrise an hour later, now effectively you're going to be making the students show up 30 minutes earlier than they had been previously. So, and California is one of those states that's actually pushing for permanent daylight saving time, which would basically erase all the benefits of that legislation. Now, a little bit better there because they do have that legislation, whereas other states don't. So while the poor students in California will only be 30 minutes put out, some other places in the states might actually be an hour disadvantaged. All right, so just to summarize what I was telling you with this, is that our body clocks have to follow the sun. That is what we follow. A light bulb isn't enough. You really do need bright natural light to set your circadian clock. And it doesn't matter what our alarm clocks or our watches tell us, or what our boss or our teachers or professors tell us, but our biology will follow the sunlight, follow the daylight. And this can lead to social jet lag when there's a mismatch between the day-night cycle and our social clocks that we have to follow for work and school. So if we abandon this tradition of springing forward and falling back, the biannual clock change, that's actually a good thing because there are some adverse health consequences, particularly in the spring when we lose that hour of sleep. But essentially, our body still follows the sun. So it's not that we have that hour of sleep that we're losing, but we're also now trying to be active at a time when our body clock doesn't want us to. We're getting up an hour earlier than it wants us to. And so we're actually living in a permanent state of jet lag the whole time we're on daylight saving time, because our body wants to follow the natural time of the sun. So permanent standard time actually is a better approach because this minimizes the conflict between our social clock and the solar clock and moves us more towards a natural time that our body wants to follow. And the benefits of that then would be that this will lead to greater individual health, that will have lower rates of disease like obesity and diabetes and cancer, we'll have more sleep, better on the job performance, less absenteeism. So there's lots of reasons to move to permanent natural time, permanent standard time, as opposed to the daylight time. All right, so this has been fun. It's nice to apply some of the knowledge we learn as a neuroscientist and how our body works to trying to help society. And I hope the governments will listen to us and opt for a much better approach of this permanent natural time, permanent standard time. Thanks.